say that though other days may not be so bright as we look towards the future, that the brightest days will continue to be those in which we visited you here in Ireland. Thank you.
1963. Racial tension threatens to explode across the southern states of America. The Profumo scandal breaks in England. The first woman in space is a Russian cosmonaut. And just as he promised, Cassius Clay knocks out Henry Cooper in the fifth. These stories lead in Irish newspapers, pushing domestic news off the front page. It seems that when the reading public looks for excitement, it looks abroad, particularly to England and America. And yet, at home in Ireland, a quiet revolution is underway. Gone is De Valera's dream of a simple island people who speak an ancient Celtic tongue. Today's Irish are restless, anxious to take their place among the modern European nations. The monolithic structures of church and state, which have preserved the status quo for decades, are now under increasing pressure to change. Sean Lemass, a highly progressive statesman who embodies the new spirit of Ireland, has been Taoiseach since 1959. Under Lemass, Ireland's first programme for economic expansion, launched in 1958, has been pushed steadily forward. In the years up to 1963, more than 100 industrial plants have sprung up around the country, creating thousands of new jobs. Though the industrial sector is growing, a large part of the population is still engaged in subsistence farming. The smallest viable farm is considered to be 45 acres, yet there are over 200,000 farms of 30 acres and less. And living conditions are poor in rural areas. 90% of homes are without running water, 50% are without electricity. Predictably, there is a huge exodus from the countryside, many taking advantage of the new opportunities in urban industry. The Catholic Church, too, is feeling the winds of change. There has been a significant decline in the number of Irish vocations. Tension is growing between the clergy and the more progressive politicians. New influences are abroad, influences which are largely beyond the control of the Church. Women are victims of a multifaceted sexism, so blatant and so pervasive that it stands as an invisible backdrop to Irish society. Under the terms of the marriage bar, a married woman cannot be employed by the civil service, the local authority, or most large companies. Furthermore, a single woman employed by one of these entities must quit her job if she does marry. Clearly, it is expected that women will seek fulfillment inside marriage, and for the most part, this expectation is not questioned. This, then, is Ireland, a small country, somewhat outside the mainstream of events, but determined nonetheless to make a place for itself in the modern world. One consequence of this drive for fuller integration in the global community is the desperate search by the Irish for international validation of any kind. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a man who has risen to the highest of stations and who openly acknowledges his Irish Catholic ancestry, is therefore a potent figure. So when the 35th President of the United States arrived in Ireland on the 26th of June, 1963, the welcome he received was, at the same time, astonishing, and predictable.
Mr. President, we welcome you for yourself. As a distinguished scion of our race, who has won first place amongst his countrymen, first in 180, in a nation of 180 millions of people. We are proud of you, Mr. President. We admire you for the leadership you are giving. We trust that under God's inspiration and with his help, you will be able to accomplish the aims which you have in mind, the aims of all who love mankind.
Not only was it four of the happiest days of President John F. Kennedy's life, but it was four of the happiest days of mine. From that first arrival at Dublin Airport and the greeting by President de Valera and the Irish people, and then that long ride down O'Connell Street all the way to Phoenix Park. And I rode in the car behind the president with our Secret Service and the Irish police. And you have a better idea of the welcome. 500,000 turned out to see their cousin from America. And it was such a wonderful, wonderful greeting. And I can remember the shops. Everywhere you looked, you saw the American flag and the Irish flag, a cross like this, and a smiling picture of President Kennedy, and above it it read, Cade Miller-Faulty, and he fell in love with that. He worked it into some of his speeches.
Well, it's 30 years ago, and I remember it very distinctly. I was then 32 years of age. I was the youngest member in the government, the last man on the team to meet him. Sean Lemass greeted him, of course, and went right down through the whole row of ministers out at Dublin Airport. My first impact was of a man of extraordinary personality. The minute he shook hands with you, you knew you were in the presence of somebody who meant something. He had it, to use a phrase.
I am deeply honored to be your guest in the free parliament of a free island. If this nation had achieved its present political and economic stature a century or so ago, my great-grandfather might never have left New Ross, and I might, if fortunate, be sitting down there with you. Of course, if your own president had never left Brooklyn, he might be standing up here instead of me.
The reaction all over the world to Kennedy, and more especially the culmination of his own instinctive power and strength when he overcame the really terrifying Cuban crisis with the Russians at the height of their power as well. All these factors made Kennedy a tremendous figure of almost superhuman and international world strength when he arrived. You're talking in terms of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar. Now, these may be exaggerations, but in 100 or 200 years' time, the significance will be realized.
It's hard to understand now the semi-hysteria that was about at the time about him coming. He was the first American president to visit this country, I think, and he was also Irish and Catholic, and I suppose every single man, woman and child had been rooting for him to win the election. I myself, I don't like that sort of thing, so I decided to get as far away from Dublin on the day of the visit as I could. So I took the boat to the Aran Islands, which is as far away as I could afford to go. And while we were, I remember it was a fine day because we were all up on deck on the boat, and some idiot had a radio with him, and we got the full belt of the speech. Everything I tried to avoid, I got anyway. But there was a lot of. I suppose it was a big day for Ireland when you consider it in retrospect. It was a great honour there were a lot of little countries that he didn't go to. So, you know, not to be too cranky about it, I suppose a lot of the hoo-ha was justified, but I think we go overboard on that sort of thing. We certainly went overboard when he came to Ireland.
I'm glad to be here. It took 115 years to make this trip. And 6,000 miles. And 3 generations. But I'm proud to be here, and I appreciate the warm welcome you've given to all of us. When my great-grandfather left here to become a cooper in East Boston, he carried nothing with him except 2 things: a strong religious faith and a strong desire for liberty.
We went to New Ross, which is in County Wexford, and that is the place where actually Kennedy's great-grandfather had sailed to the United States about 100 years earlier, and that was a very important place that John Kennedy was going to. And we had a meeting with a man, I think his name was Lenihan, who was the leader of the New Ross region. And at one point he said, you know, we're not going to change this city. This is an Irish city. We're not going to change it. Well, I wasn't going to argue with him about that. But I noticed that about 25 yards away from where John Kennedy was going to speak at New Ross, there was a huge pile of dung. And so I said, well, do you mind moving the dung away? No, he says, that's Irish dung. It's going to stay there. And it did stay there.
The only thing I remember about being in New Ross was that I was clambering up a scaffolding, again in the midst of throngs and throngs of people, and the place going wild, and he talked about emigration, and he talked about his family having left those shores to go to America, and he identified very much indeed with the people down in that direction. And then something went wrong with the microphones or the sound or something, and I remember Andy Moynihan doing his celebrated, oh, we're all in queer trouble now, or words to that effect.
I think it was in New Ross that I noticed something that was a feature of the Kennedy visit, and that's the local Irish politicians all look so much older. They all belong to a quite different generation. Their older clothes and so on. And they were watching this young man with extraordinary intensity, because they knew he had magic. They wanted to know what was the key. How could they discover how to turn people on?
After speaking in New Ross, we took a motorcade to Duncanstown, and would you believe it? He's looking out and he said, Dave, see that fellow there? He's run all the way from New Ross side by side. He said, we ought to take him back to America and put him in the marathon. And what enthused, he was so enthused. He just wanted to reach out to every one of them. And I had trouble keeping him on time. You know, we had a real tight schedule. And finally, when we arrived at Ryan's, it was, you know, he just looked at that house where his great-grandfather, Patrick, had lived in, you know? And they were stored, seemed to me they had green and things stored there now. And he just wanted to know more about it. And he felt bad that he did not know more about the history. And we went in, and Mrs. Ryan had the tea and everything. But Cousin Jimmy handed him a shot of Irish whiskey. And he said, here, cousin, this will make you feel better. Well, the president slipped it to me. And I had the job of downing it that early in the morning, you know? And the president said, I had to give him back an empty glass. He said, I couldn't lose face among my cousins. because the president really wasn't a drinking man, or he wasn't up to Irish whiskey that early in the morning. So I think at the rest of the day I felt a little groggy. There must have been 4 ounces in it, 4 ounces of Jameson.
We felt that the president was our cousin coming home to visit us, because he was his dad and my father were third cousins, and that had been proved beyond all doubt. So he had come here in the 1940s, and on his way up the road he met an old man inquiring the way. When he came back here 20 years later as president, the first man he asked for was that very same man. Probably in the meantime he had shook hands with probably millions of people and spoke to millions of people. And just to be able to think of that name after 20 years I felt was something special in the man.
He was reminiscing again about the trip to Ireland and telling us how really much he had liked it, and when he went, I think he had really no expectations. I think he didn't know exactly what